This is an audio recording of The Barroom Collection by David Duhaime, narrated by the author. Story number 4, The Manning Years. Commander Manning would stop around in the old days, when Lily was the bartender. He'd buy me a drink and offer me a Chesterfield, the kind with no filter. He'd always bring Lily flowers, but she treated him with a distant courtesy. Manning knew Lily from the old days, when the Navy Yard was the Navy Yard, and Lily tended bar right outside the gate on Flushing Avenue. Commander Manning knew Lily's first husband, but was married himself at the time, working at the yard, living on Long Island, convenient to the Long Island Railroad. After Lily's second husband passed away, Lily allowed Commander Manning to ask her out for the evening. For reasons yet to be divulged, he failed to show that fateful night, and never again would Lily make a date with our boy Jack. Commander Manning had many names in his life: Jackie Boy, Master Manning, Private Manning, Machine Gun Manning. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. John Manning Sr., his father, was a sergeant major in Her Majesty's Fusiliers, or was it Grenadiers, from the turn of the 20th century until the end of the First World War. He retired with his pension to the colonies and took up residence in Queens, New York. Master Manning attended St. John's Prep, where they praised him for his composition just before they suspended him for the content of the composition. It seems he made a well-reasoned argument proving Christ did not die on the cross, but was revived by Nicodemus, the preeminent physician of his day. St. John's Prep was, and I imagine still is, a bastion of rectitude and orthodoxy. When the roll was called, "Master Manning, present," was the required response. "Yo" was not a part of the vocabulary. "Master Adams, present." "Master Bakerfield, present, sir." When they called for Charles Bader, they called for Master Charles, showing a sense of discretion one might not expect. Sergeant Major Manning, the father, came from a long line of soldiers, drank Beefeater's gin, and told his son, "Jackie Boy, always remember, God save the Queen, but never forget, God bless America." With this advice under his belt, he followed in the footsteps of his fathers before him, and in the middle of the Great Depression, when jobs were scarce, he enlisted in the United States Army with his father's blessing. Sometimes Lily would have to quiet Commander Manning down. The sight of her coming around the bar was usually enough to do it. The determined look on her face would have shushed Hermann Goering. "Were you there?" Jack used to shout. "Were you there?" he'd shout at the top of his lungs. "Then shut your yap," he'd say, and continue his story. Jack Manning was of the opinion that if you listen to any member of the veterans of foreign war, they won World War II single-handed. Once, and only once, did Jack Manning's tirade, "Were you there? Were you there? Then shut your yap," would fail to silence the peanut gallery. That was when the old salt from the Navy Yard said in a very serious tone, "I was there," and he told the story of General Douglas MacArthur, the submarine, his office furniture, and the nurses left behind on Corregidor. The sailors from the sub begged their captain to let them stay behind to make room for the girls. But no, orders were orders. While some major general of the wax, sitting on her fat ass, safe in Washington, said, "My girls can take it." I'm getting ahead of my story, but I will say that as a sign of respect, Jack didn't interrupt once. And as the old salt made his way out of the bar, Commander Manning gave his imprimatur and said he was there. The Sergeant Major, Jack's father, didn't talk too much about life in the trenches during World War I. His lungs had been damaged by an attack of mustard gas. Jack said he described the events with a certain brevity and detachment. The Sergeant Major would laugh out loud when he spoke of the young lieutenant, fresh from the playing fields of Eton, who commanded him in that voice officers use with their troops. "Sergeant, I want you to take your squad and assault that position," as he pointed to a well-fortified machine gun bunker on the top of a distant hill. A gentle sloping meadow with little or no cover provided by the spring grass fell from the foot of the bunker to the tree line at the bottom of the meadow where the troops lay hidden. Commander Manning would delight in acting out the part of his father, where he would spring to attention with precise military bearing, snap a salute worthy of the Queen herself, and he'd say, "Aye, aye, Lieutenant, ready to move out when you are, sir." "Sergeant, you don't seem to understand." "Aye, aye, sir. I'm behind you all the way, sir. I'll move out when you do, sir." It was obvious that the elder Manning understood quite well. In order to bring charges, the lieutenant would have to explain his own behavior in the matter, and the assault on the position ended there. Lily the bartender was like a window in time. Her upbringing in pre-war Germany expressed itself in so many ways. On Wednesdays, I would bring her a copy of the Frankfurt Zeitung. There were no words to express her appreciation, nor were they necessary. But my glass was never empty. On holidays, she would dress in the traditional garb of her youth, the same peasant costume the girls in Germany's eastern provinces have worn since Martin Luther King and the Protestant Revolution. Prussia was the old name for those vast fields of wheat and potatoes, the breadbasket of Europe. Puffy sleeves gathered above the elbow, extra flower print cloth only partially covering an ample bosom, and yards of skirt down to a firm ankle and sensible shoes. Many an afternoon I had Lily to myself. She'd confide in me, and I'd tease her. She reminded me of my grandmother, on my mother's side, as I knew her in the 1950s. And although Lily was old enough to be my mother, she was young enough to be my big sister, the implications of which neither of us were unaware. From time to time, customers at the bar would ask Lily, what was life like before the war? Her answers were usually terse, to the point, and non-informative. On lazy afternoons, when only Lily and I were in the bar, my glass was never empty, and she confided with just enough candor for one in the know to piece it together. As a young girl, in the spring, after school was out for the season, she and all the other girls from the village would ride on horse-drawn wagons into the fields. In the early spring, they tilled the soil and planted the crop. In July, they'd pull the weeds. In autumn, They'd harvest the wheat and corn and potatoes and the myriad other crops that made their way to the tables of Berlin, Dusseldorf, Paris, and points abroad. Young girls have been riding those horse-drawn carts since before my great-great-grandmother was born. She might have been one of them. One spring, after school was out, the girls gathered in the square where the carts stood at the ready. As the girls climbed aboard, a local politician pinned an armband on the girls' simple cotton work dresses. He saluted them with the new salute of the Nationalist Socialist Party extravaganza and congratulated them on their induction into the Hitler Youth. The girls on the carts were the same as last year, the horses too. There were changes, however. The harvest, in previous years, had been supervised by the owner, who lived in the large rambling mansion looking out over the major portion of his acreage. But times had changed. The master of the big house now was a party official. Lily was chosen to come out of the fields and take up the duties of a servant in the big house. Lily was raised in her early years as a Roman Catholic. Her father proved to be a brutal man, and her mother found it necessary to leave her husband and throw herself on the mercy of Holy Mother Church. In those days, the Church, in her wisdom, disapproved of women who left their husbands, still does, and proved unhelpful. Lily, her sisters, her mother and brother moved to the Frankfurt area, turned their back on the Catholic Church, and became staunch supporters of the Lutheran faith. Lily was especially close-mouthed about the goings-on in the big house. But she confided in me that she would have preferred to work with the other girls in the field. It was with a sense of relief that she was shipped off with several other girls to work in the aircraft factory. She claimed to know nothing of the end result of her work, but described her job as having to fit a round object into a round hole, and God forbid if the clearances were not correct. I have no doubt Lily was one of the finest piston fitters of World War II. Rosie the Riveter had nothing on her. Aircraft's engines go into airplanes. Henkel, I asked her. She gave me such a look and shushed me. Loose lips sink ships, even after all these years. Fokker, I asked. She gave me a look as cold as the retreat from Moscow and the Eastern Front. After some of the nosy Parkers left the cafe, she whispered in my ear, Dame Lear. Most of the motors were shipped to Messerschmitt. She taught me that people will tell you the most extraordinary things if you just let them. You didn't need a calendar to tell when the first of the month rolled around. Commander Manning would walk through the door like clockwork. The old-timers in the bar knew that if the check came early, so did Manning. Conversely, if the check came late, so did Jack. Just like on the night he missed his date with Lily. I never saw him dressed in anything but the uniform of a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, except the time he showed up in full cowboy regalia, but we don't count that. The crease in his pants was as sharp as a bayonet. The shine on his shoes, purchased at the PX, were worthy of a brigadier. If I was there, he would spring to attention and say, "Request permission to come aboard, sir." And I reply with my best imitation of Admiral Halsey, "Permission granted. Come aboard, Commander." "Aye, aye, sir," he'd reply, as he snapped to a smart salute Hell, you don't have to sir me. I'm out of uniform. Aye, aye, Captain. We'd have a good laugh. The joke was, I'd never been in uniform, and Manning never held the rank of commander. There were times when he had to make decisions like a five-star general. That's the part we're working up to. As I've said before, the flowers in his hand were for Lily. Her posture would change dramatically. Suddenly taller and slimmer, and looking 10 years younger, she received Suitor Manning with the dignity of Bertha Krupp herself. Manning would open a recently purchased pack of Chesterfield, made the old-fashioned way, and pass a few around. I smoked cigarettes on special occasions, and this was one of them. It was well known the cigarettes, just like those Social Security checks, had to last a month. His stories had to last me a month as well, and I don't mind saying, I look forward to Commander Manning walking through the door, dressed like a lieutenant, but with no insignia showing. An affectation he borrowed from MacArthur. In MacArthur's case, the general habitually dressed in the khakis of a young pledge at West Point. Some say he did it to prove he could fit into his college clothes. I think he did it so he wouldn't get shot. He was heard to remark, snipers are looking for generals. Private Manning took his basic training at Fort Bragg. Perhaps because of his prep school education, he was assigned to a special unit, patrolling the waters of the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. You've heard of the wackiest ship in the Army? This was the coldest ship in the Army. In those days, Alaska was not a state, it was a territory, and as such, was under the protection of Uncle Sam. The job fell to the Army. Unbeknownst to most people, the Army has its own boats. Some are used for troop transport, some are used for communication between outlying islands. The best use of Uncle Sam's Army's Navy was to make a run-up to the hospital with supplies for the nurses. Cases of liquor, the latest movies, condoms. Hell, nurses like to have fun too. Besides, being left behind on Corregidor was no joyride. I'd like to think there were some compensations. Private Manning's basic training was unremarkable, but for one thing. By chance, when he was issued his rifle, other men were handed Springfields that had fired enough rounds to wear the barrel out. His was brand new, still in the Cosmoline, having spent the First World War at the back of some armory. Private Manning held on to his Springfield throughout his entire career. He gave me the wink, with his one good eye, indicating the rifle was home in his closet to this very day. He didn't think much of the M1 Garand, but had good things to say about the Browning BAR. You hardly ever saw one, though, until the end of the war. The rifle in Manning's closet has fired no more than 1,000 rounds, total. That barrel is as straight and true as the day it was rifled and honed just like Manning. The Army's mission was to protect the Alaskan fishing industry, king crab, wild salmon, etc., by imposing a 250-mile limit on the foreign fishing fleets. The Japanese were consistent violators, claiming the international limit of 12 miles. Tensions flared, sabers rattled, and in 1938, a Japanese trawler with more than one radio antenna was sighted well within the restricted area, sitting low in the water. The vessel appeared fat with king crab, diverted from San Francisco to Tokyo and points west of Tokyo, that is. The trawler failed to respond to signals. In frustration, The captain of the coldest ship in the Army ordered the men to remove the protective covering from the forward gun, as if the sight of this antiquated 5-pounder would induce the Japanese to heave to and allow themselves to be boarded and searched. When the trawler broke for open water, the captain, who was only a lieutenant, ordered the forward gun to fire a warning shot across their bow. It's an unknown fact that only 5 to 10% of the men in the Army actually ever engage in combat, and that only 5 to 10% of them actually pull the trigger. The Army keeps records of men who do. For some reason, the sergeant in charge of the forward gun balked at firing the weapon. "Private Manning," called a voice through a megaphone, "fire a shot across the bow of that vessel." Doing as he was ordered, Commander Manning aimed the small cannon and pulled the trigger. A court of inquiry was held, and it was determined that due to adverse weather conditions, high seas, insufficient training, and a lack of ammunition to conduct such training, Gunner Manning, as he was now called, should not be held responsible for the fact that the shot fired did not go across the bow. It went through it, below the waterline. The trawler sank fast enough to prevent the crew from destroying secret documents, but slow enough to allow the Japanese naval officers, disguised as common fishermen, to be rescued. The Army salvaged enough electronic equipment from the wreck to prove the invasion of the Aleutian Islands was already in the works. It was 1938, and the first shot of World War II in the Pacific Theater had just been fired. Our boy Jack was there. He pulled the trigger. As the Depression came to a close, so did Gunner Manning's tour of duty. A lagging economy, the promise of promotion, and the chance to get into a real fight convinced now Corporal Manning to re-up. Fighting men just love to fight. Let them lie around base too long, and they'll fight each other. Promise them nasty weather, a long, exhausting hike, and cold food with a huge battle at the end, and they're raring to go. Generals know that sort of thing. Corporal Manning's outfit was regular Army. That meant promotion for those who saw action. But this was peacetime, and promotions were hard to come by. December 7th, 1941, found Corporal Manning training in the Arizona desert. Rommel was traipsing around North Africa like he owned the place, and the Army was gearing up to stop him. Jack's company had sold off all their winter clothes, heavy wool uniforms, wolfskin overcoats, mukluks purchased from Eskimos who knew how to survive the harsh Alaskan winter. Now the outfit had lightweight summer uniforms, suitable for desert warfare, long marches in the sand and heat, cold sea rations, not enough water for a shower. All the ingredients to make a fighting man very mad. Around base, some soldiers passed the time playing cards or dice or betting on anything in sight. Some wrote letters home or kept a journal, hoping to write the great American novel like this one. Manning spent his time cleaning the Springfield and the M1 Garand he was issued. Now soldiers will bet on anything. Some young lion, hearing of Manning's exploits and seeing him in possession of an M1, challenged him to a shooting contest. The gunner accepted and sent a member of the squad to fetch the Springfield. The young pup tried to withdraw from the contest, But Manning stood his ground. He didn't agree to shoot until an entire paycheck was on the line. You challenged me, I accepted. I never said I wouldn't use my Springfield. You can imagine the outcome. Scuttlebutt had it that something big was in the works. Leave was canceled. Dependents were sent packing. All very hush-hush. The outfit boarded troop trains under the cover of darkness. Destination unknown. Rumors ran rampant. We're going to invade the Japanese mainland, says one. We're going to save MacArthur's ass in the Philippines, says another. Transferred to troop ships under the cover of darkness, the gunner was sure they would see the Panama Canal and action in North Africa. After spending several days at sea, the troops, dressed in their desert uniforms, recognized the coast of Alaska they had just left a few months ago. That's the Army for you. It's a commonly held belief that the United States has never been invaded by a foreign power. I suppose that is technically true. Alaska was not a state at the time. What is true is that Japan, shortly after Pearl Harbor, landed an invasion force in the Western Hemisphere, in the Aleutian Islands, off the coast of Alaska, with the intent of marching on British Vancouver, Seattle, and San Francisco. The only thing standing in their way was a bunch of young men dressed in desert uniforms, spoiling for a fight. These dog faces had two things to their advantage. They knew the terrain, and they had Gunner Manning. As you can imagine, the first paychecks were spent on the same wool uniforms, wolfskin overcoats, and mucklucks purchased from the same Eskimos they had sold them to just a few months earlier. Now came the waiting. It is said that war is hours of endless boredom punctuated by moments of intense fear. The boredom set in. Discipline began to suffer. Positions up and down the beach were fortified. There was no more joyrides up to the hospital with supplies for the nurses. The girls had left to join MacArthur in the Philippines. Not one of them would ever be the same again. Rumor had it that the Japs had landed troops on the unprotected outer islands. One afternoon, a lone airplane appeared on the horizon. Slowly, it made its way up the shoreline. The markings were clearly American. The soldiers on the beach waved hello. Several planes soon followed the Pathfinder. A few minutes later, the planes returned in force. To the horror of the men on the ground, the planes began to strafe the beach. Sizing up the situation, Gunner Manning, now in charge of several positions, ordered his men to open fire. Hesitant to fire on American pilots, the soldiers balked at pulling the trigger. The gunner sprang into action. He brushed aside a frightened recruit, took control of his machine gun, and began to fire. The weapon in his hand was a Lewis gun. Old-fashioned by World War II standards, it had one thing to recommend it. If you keep it clean and well-oiled, point it in the right direction, and pull the trigger, the effect can be devastating. Following the gunner's example, the other men opened fire, slowly at first, but soon they were in full song. The effect on those planes that afternoon was certainly devastating. Manning claimed 3 of them, or at least he claimed that he claimed 3 of them. Several more were burning up and down the beach. Didn't take too much to figure out what happened. If American pilots were strafing the beachhead, it was because they believed the troops on the ground to be the enemy. It was thought at the time that the American public would panic if they knew the armed forces expected an attack in the Aleutians. The deployment of Jack's division back to Alaska was strictly, "Hush, hush." The right hand was told, "Loose lips sink ships." The left hand was told, "Nothing." Those pilots never knew there was a possibility of friendlies on the ground. But if the pilots were prepared to engage hostile troops, where were the hostile troops they were supposed to fire on? The optimistic answer was 5 islands over. The reality was somewhat closer. The machine gun positions under his care had exhausted their ammunition. Remember, once Jack opened fire, the other gunners followed his lead. Machine Gun Manning, as he was now called, after the friendly fire incident, knew what he had to do. He commandeered a jeep and raced to the ammo dump. A young 90-day wonder, fresh from the officers' candidate school, was on duty. He had the key, but would not unlock the warehouse without orders from above. Jack handed his trusty Springfield to one of his squad who rode along and said, "If this man moves an inch, shoot him." "Aye, aye, sir." That's what you say when Machine Gun Manning orders you to shoot someone. You point your rifle at the guy's belly and say, "Aye, aye, sir." When you're fresh from the cornfields of Iowa and your squad leader just shot several planes out of the sky with an antique gun, you take his word over a lieutenant's. You might be next. Always a stickler for protocol, Machine Gun Manning calmly explained to the young recruit. The correct response is, "Yes, Corporal." "You do not have to sir me, son. I'm not an officer." "Yes, sir," was the young man's reply. Addressing a man who just killed a number of people, be that number large or small, somehow anything less than "sir" seems inadequate. Jumping into the driver's seat of a forklift truck, Jack neatly lifted the door of the warehouse off its tracks. After hitching up a trailer to the back of the Jeep, Jack loaded enough ammunition for all the encampments on the beach. It wasn't long before the pessimistic version of the story began to play out. A small armada of landing craft appeared on the horizon. Manning's resupply came not a moment too soon. Those boats, bobbing on the water, didn't look like anything built in good old USA, and in fact, they were filled with the brave young sons of the Emperor from the land of the rising sun. The only obstacle in their way was a few machine gun positions dug in along the beach, and a division of dog faces. Mudsluggers, Manning used to say. These fellows were not like the draftees you had later in the war. These men were regular Army, trained professionals, with their blood up after being strafed by their own countrymen. When it counted the most, all the war games and planning paid off. Jack's company knew the drill. They rehearsed defensive procedures on this very beach. Commander Manning didn't go into too many details, but he did say they stopped them at the waterline, with a great loss of life on both sides in hand-to-hand combat. When he told this story, he would leap off his seat and yell, "Dog faces!" Grasping an imaginary Springfield with bayonet attached, he'd scream, "Mudsluggers!" and demonstrate the proper thrust angle for the kill. Lily would come around the bar so fast she'd make your head spin. Jack would leap back into his seat and act the innocent child. When he'd yell, "Were you there? Were you there?" Then shut your yap. I was reminded of the old radio show. I'm not sure if it was One Man's Family or Fibber McGee and Molly. The man would say, "Was you there, Charlie?" And if the answer was no, oh, well then, the exaggerations flowed freely. It's hard to know what to believe. Commander Manning told me that story more than once. The second time, he confessed to me he felt so bad about the events of that day he went to see the chaplain. After listening to his story, this chaplain put his arm around Manning's shoulder and said, "Jack, if I may call you Jack, if anything like this happens again, I want you to do the exact same thing. Then I want you to come and tell me about it." Commander Manning's lack of detail concerning the blood and gore sold me on him. I'm a believer. He was there.